Hey guys, it's Matthew here once again, and today I want to show you the Gladiator Varunastra Earthquake, which inevitably turned into Blade Flurry, as everything does, Gladiator. Now the point of this character was to test out Gladiator, since I've never actually played the class before, and I wanted to play around with a Varunastra for the first time in quite a long time, since they were fairly affordable at the time, and just wanted to test how far it could take me and whether or not it's worth playing with. Long story short, it does seem to be pretty decent at the moment, but I still have some tests pending for Binos. So as you can see, we started out with Earthquake, and it was going pretty well. The goal was to just scale bleed insanely, so you have a lot of bleed on the initial first hit, which Earthquake is very good at doing. So, it was pretty consistent for its large amounts of bleeds and pretty big first hits. And it was working out well, but it was a little bit inconsistent with the crit rate, and sometimes just the AoE didn't feel as good, and I don't know, there was bits and pieces that just didn't feel quite good enough, so eventually I ended up testing out Blade Flurry, and it performed better across the board, even though the initial hit is slightly less for Blade Flurry for the bleed, but it still ended up being a lot better for the overall build of the character. Before I proceed any further, I will show you real quick what we're building around. So the main culprit here is Gratuitous Violence. Gives you a 25% chance to bleed, and then the bleed will then explode enemies that you kill, dealing 10% of their max life as fizz, which is scalable through fizz damage. Thus, the bleeds become bigger, or the explosions become bigger, and it's really nice for pack clearing. On top of that, I've got Outmatch and Outlast, which is essentially going to be replacing Blood Rage for Frenzy generation, and then on top of that, another 10% more physical damage with the frenzy charges. And then we got Painforged for block, and of course Versatile Combatant, so that all of our block becomes spell block as well. And we're building around the Varunastra. If you're unaware of what it is just a sword with a bunch of physical damage that then counts as any one-hand melee weapon type, meaning your passive tree can grab dagger nodes, claw nodes, sword nodes, mace nodes, just pretty much everything, which means you can get some, take advantage of some really good clusters of nodes throughout the entire tree. So as I said, it did inevitably turn into Blade Flurry because I tried out Blade Flurry in a number of situations, and it was just hands down better for the build than Earthquake in pretty much every situation. So it is a bit unfortunate that we ended up playing another Blade Flurry character, but it's been a while since I've done one this league again. It's been, a couple months since I did the Assassin. So in the end, it's just going to be a pretty valid comparison between the Assassin and this Gladiator type character. So the only real difference in budget for this one is we're not running a Sin's Rebirth because we're not focusing on poison at all for the build, and also the main weapon Varunastra costs a bit more than a Binos. So currently I am testing with the Varunastra because it's got a lot of initial damage and also crit multi you can scale from the tree and all this other fancy stuff, but I will test with Binos probably tomorrow and then get you more results there too, so that we can make a more definitive conclusion as to which sort of Blade Flurry is probably better to be played, especially at the start of the league. Because at this stage, this character is just pure Varunastra. It's got some pretty solid DPS, and it's really quite tanky as well, at least compared to the Shadow. So all in all, it ended up being a character that can clear everything, and I'd say with Varunastra, probably a superior character to the Blade Flurry Assassin. And that is mostly just because of overall playstyle. You're a bit tankier, it's a lot safer on most content, but it does have slightly worse single target because you're not abusing poison as well. Though that said, you can absolutely abuse poison too, and it's probably what I'll end up recommending you do in the end if we try and make this our league starter instead of the Assassin. So currently I'm showing you pretty much all of the content that it's cleared, and this is an Uber Atziri run. It's my first one. The only problem here is I didn't have a bleed immune flask, so I had to play around them quite a bit instead of just face tanking, because the DPS is there, as you'll be able to see for sure. The problem is just not enough face tank because I didn't have the bleed flask. But the DPS is certainly there to kill all the content. It's just worse than the poison scaling Assassin because, well, that goes pretty fucking high. So I will definitely try out with a Binos on this character tomorrow as well and see what the poison bleed combo can achieve for us on all the content, and more or less become a budget build in that regard. I still won't focus very heavily on poison because I don't want to use a Sin's Rebirth or any other expensive type of shit, but I definitely will try and turn it into the most complete character it can be on a budget so that we can establish whether or not this should be played as a league starter. So this is just the Hydra fight we're going over here. It's poison immune, which, as you can tell, does absolutely nothing to us. And it's also a pretty fucking tough fight. This one is a minus max vulnerability, double elemental damage, and more life. And the damage is pretty damn substantial, even though... well, we're not really abusing too many broken mechanics here. It's just a Varunastra with some front-loaded damage and some bleed. And we're also fairly tanky. So it's got something like 50% block and spell block when you factor in the Ascendancies. And on top of that, some pretty good leech, some pretty good armor. Just an overall fairly good character for this content, because these next few... things I show you, all the Guardians, I did all of them deathless, even though I rolled some pretty insane maps. And then I did Shaper, which was probably the worst for this character because Shaper is much more reliant on big DPS. So the longer the fight goes on, the harder it is. And that's why the Shaper run was worse than the rest of these. But this is a Chimera with a vulnerability. I think it was minus max, monster life, and crit strikes as well. So he hits me really hard because of the mods, but otherwise it's actually a very safe run. Chimera himself can barely do too much damage to you when you have, easy enough mods on this map. And the ads are somewhat scary, but they die pretty quickly. That said, without the dangerous mods that this map has, the ads actually don't hit you very hard at all on this character. Since we have Fortify, since we have a good chunk of armor and a good chunk of block and spell block, it's all pretty safe and reliable, and it's probably a much nicer character to do all of these Guardians and content with than the Assassin version, which, as I mentioned, just... the only upside it has is a lot more poison damage, and hopefully the Binos version of this character will do all the content just the same, just be much cheaper thanks to being a Binos. Because the problem here with this Varunastra is it's only got 5 base crit, so I have to use the crit strikes gem, and then even then I still only have 7 base crit, whereas a Binos starts out with 10 crit. So hopefully that really bridges the gap and still gives us quite a lot of DPS. We will almost certainly lose some crit multi and some attack speed, but maybe we'll make it up with some crit and I don't know, some free passives, I guess, to be more block oriented. This Phoenix here was a minus max crit monster life, I think, with, I don't know, it was a tough Phoenix. It took me a good few minutes to kill because I had to kite around a lot and try and not die. It did end up being completely deathless still, but yeah, it was just a bit sketchy to have to run around a lot. You could see the initial DPS there was good, so if I was allowed to stand there and tank without dangerous map mods, it would have been fine, but I was just trying to see what kind of maps I could get away with, and it turns out pretty much any and all of them. And even this Phoenix here, which was pretty damn dangerous, managed to do deathless. It was just a bit, sketchy and needed some avoidance to run around and outplay him more or less. But with an easier map, I think he should be very face tankable and just easily killable, just like all the other Guardians. That said, the Minotaur is up next, and he's the one that, well, I thought I would have the most troubles with because he's supposed to be bleed immune, I believe, and that's where a large part of my damage comes from. But even he was not too much of a problem, since we're pretty damn tanky against it, even though the map that I rolled here I think has quite a bit of damage mods on it, or something, I can't quite remember. But here it is. The DPS was pretty substantial when we got our ideal setup going. So make sure he does his burrow, throw down a trap, put down a totem. The totem there, by the way, purely for, well, it does a bit of damage, but it's mostly there to boost our damage. And then almost kill him immediately there. Just not quite. So it's still pretty substantial damage, all things considered, with no poison abuse, which would otherwise wreck him immediately, because, yeah, Minotaur dies to poison pretty damn easily. I tried to do a good bit of face tank here, as you can see, doing quite a bit of blocking, but in the end, I ran out of flasks, I ran out of pretty much everything, and I was just destined to die at least one time on all of these runs. If you were, smarter than that, you definitely should have portaled out and reset flasks. Now for Shaper, it's kind of a long fight. Like I said, the DPS isn't amazing, so you do have to wait for the ideal opportune moment to get your DPS in. Up until then, just kind of kiting around, and ads die pretty quickly. Sometimes you'll feel like you need to use flasks for them. Sometimes one trap is enough. It really depends, but I was trying my best to save flasks for Shaper so that when I did get a good little opportunity to DPS him, I could kill him almost immediately. Because these couple little seconds here or there that I get just aren't enough. You definitely need to wait until he's got his melee attacks on you and just giving you a good 20 seconds to do DPS. That's when you can kill him, and I do certainly end up doing that. Got a couple of runs in the end, and they were both okay. I just messed up a few times, and the worse DPS you have in a character, the more opportunity you have to mess up against something like Shaper. I won't show you the entire fight. Take my word for it. It ended up, being a bit long and tedious, but very doable. I just wouldn't particularly recommend this one for Shaper. It's doable, but it's not a face roll. I'll go over real quick how I built the character though. There's nothing too special in it. It is still ultimately a Blade Flurry physical build. Like I mentioned, the only real special thing here is a Varunastra, and that is going to be supplemented or replaced with a Binos, and we'll see how that goes in the end. Aside from that, the only other special item is the Surrender, which is the new Minotaur shield. So it gives you a good chunk of block, good chunk of armor when you've blocked recently, and some life recovered when you block as well. So it's a nice tanky addition. I don't think by any means necessary, but it's not really carrying us, but it does make things a lot easier on quite larger maps. Besides that, everything else is pretty stock standard, just like, rare items with nothing too special. I will link it in my forum thread as always, and a Belly the Beast because life total on this side of the tree, especially with Varunastra, makes getting life kind of difficult, because Varunastra really wants as many amazing passives as possible, the dagger ones, the claw ones, the sword ones, and then as well I'm a block character, so I've got a bunch of block nodes, and these that triple dip for Varunastra. So in the end, you're kind of pressed for life if you want to make as much DPS as possible. Also got Iron Reflexes here, and like I said, you can definitely go bleed and poison, so poison on top of the bleed for this type of build if you grab Dirty Techniques and run a Void Heart, but I was going for pure bleed on this character, more or less to, prove a point that you don't need poison in builds, and it can be doable without it. It could even be doable without bleed by the looks of it. Not too much of our damage is bleed focused on a lot of those endgame bosses, but it certainly helps a bit. Like I said, when this is going to be a probably start of league character, you're almost certainly going to want to probably grab a Binos, get some poison bleed action happening, and it should be pretty reliable for most endgame fights, I would think. But then poison immunity comes into play and it makes it a bit tougher once again. Besides that, like I said, barely just a few normal items. Our overall setup, I do have text happening over here, lists the entire setup, but one of the reasons that this one is pretty competitive on damage is I'm running this over here, which gives us our frenzy charges on kill, and I also have frenzy charge just coming from auto attacking with frenzy whenever I need it to maintain my frenzies, which is a lot of extra damage here, and then that allows me to use melee damage on full life. Since we're so tanky and since we block quite a lot, I'm almost always at 100% life. If you go over the videos, you'll notice I'm almost always at 100% life, and that gives me a whole lot more to multiply my bleed and initial hit with, and it gives us a pretty chunky amount of damage, because otherwise there's nothing else really good to put here. Maybe faster attacks, otherwise you're relegated to things like added fire, and it's just not really that good for the fizz-based build. Maybe for poison, you got some other shit like added chaos void manipulation, but we're not, so it's a really nice bonus to be able to use this. Aside from that, pretty normal stuff: crit strikes, crit damage, blade flurry, melee damage, and area, which is of course replaced by conk half the time. Everything else we're doing, a Herald of Ash as well as a Grace. Grace giving us a whole chunk of armor instead of evasion. Herald of Ash, not really that necessary, but it's kind of nice, and you could run a Blasphemy instead if you really wanted to. I've been fine with my Witchfire giving me my vulnerability on demand. Lion's Roar, very nice for the additional melee damage as well as the knockback and the Granite Flask. Vile Haste, Vile Lightning Trap, Summon Ice Golem, increased duration. In the shield, we have a Frenzy attached to a Power Charge on crit and a Endurance Charge on melee stun. Both the Power Charge on crit and the Endurance Charge on melee stun go off with the Reckoning, which is just procced on blocks every now and again, giving you a free Power Charge or Endurance Charge every now and again. The War Chief totem I have has Bloodlust, Melee Fizz, and Conk Effect. Doesn't do that much damage, but it also buffs me, so it's pretty useful in the build. And then you have Shield Charge, Fortify, Faster Attacks, and Blood Magic. Not much else really needed to mention except for the fact that Varunastra does allow you to get all kinds of different jewels, which is one of the perks of Varunastra, of course. You can get, you know, pretty much any type of weapon node jewel. Though we don't really have too many doing that, but it does allow you to take any sort of jewel. So that's one of the perks of the Varunastra. Hopefully next time I have some good news for you guys about Binos in this build, and maybe it will be recommended as a starter. Until then, thank you very much for watching, guys, and I'll see you next time.